On a sweltering summer day in 1787, as delegates gathered in Philadelphia's Independence Hall to create a new government, they faced a question that would define America for centuries. Who deserves the right to participate in democracy? Their answer was shockingly narrow. Of the roughly 3.9 million people living in the United States at the time, only about 6% would be eligible to vote under the system they created. The other 94%, women, enslaved people, Native Americans, men without property, and various religious minorities, were deliberately excluded from what we now call American democracy. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a compromise forced by circumstances. It was a conscious design choice made by men who believed that democracy was too dangerous to be entrusted to everyone. When they wrote "We the People," they had a very specific definition of who counted as people worthy of political participation. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden truths that shaped our world. What you're about to discover will fundamentally challenge the story you learned about American democracy, the myth that it was founded on universal principles that just needed time to expand. The reality is far more complex and troubling. American democracy was never meant for everyone, and the exclusions weren't accidents to be corrected, but features designed to preserve power for a narrow elite. Before we dive into this revealing journey through America's exclusive origins, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because what we're about to explore will change how you understand the very foundations of American political life. And I'm genuinely curious about our global community. Drop a comment telling me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. The question of who gets to participate in democracy resonates across all nations and all eras. To understand why American democracy excluded so many, we must first understand the intellectual framework that guided the founders' thinking. These weren't men operating in an intellectual vacuum. They were deeply influenced by Enlightenment political theory that viewed democracy with profound suspicion and believed that political participation should be limited to those deemed capable of rational decision-making. The founders had studied the history of democratic experiments, from ancient Athens to the English Civil War, and they were terrified by what they saw. Democracy, in their view, inevitably led to mob rule, where the poor majority would confiscate the wealth of the propertied minority. James Madison captured this fear perfectly when he wrote about the violence of faction and the danger of pure democracy, which he defined as a system where there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. This wasn't abstract political theory. It was urgent practical concern shaped by recent events. Shays' Rebellion in 1786, where indebted farmers in Massachusetts rose up against foreclosures and tax collection, had shocked the founding generation. Here was proof that ordinary people, when given political power, would use it to attack property rights and destabilize society. The Constitution was designed in part to prevent such popular uprisings from threatening elite interests. Alexander Hamilton expressed this fear most bluntly during the Constitutional Convention, when he declared that "the people, sir, is a great beast." This wasn't a momentary outburst. It reflected a deep philosophical conviction, shared by most founders, that the masses were too emotional, too ignorant, and too self-interested to be trusted with democratic power. The exclusion of women from American democracy wasn't an afterthought. It was based on deeply held beliefs about gender, rationality, and political capacity that were considered scientific fact in the 18th century. The legal doctrine of coverture meant that married women had no independent legal existence. They were literally covered by their husband's legal identity, and therefore couldn't own property, sign contracts, or exercise any form of political rights. But the exclusion went deeper than legal technicalities. Enlightenment thinkers, whose ideas shaped the founding generation, believed that women were naturally emotional, irrational, and unsuited for the logical reasoning that democratic participation required. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose political theories influenced many founders, argued that women's natural role was domestic and that their participation in public life would corrupt both politics and family life. Abigail Adams's famous letter to her husband John, asking him to remember the ladies in the new code of laws, wasn't just a casual suggestion. It was a prescient warning about the consequences of political exclusion. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, she wrote, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. John Adams's response revealed the founders' true thinking about women's political participation. He dismissed her concerns with condescending humor, writing that her letter had made him laugh and that men knew better than to give up their masculine systems. But privately, Adams was more revealing, writing to James Sullivan that extending voting rights to women would be productive of confusion because it would inevitably lead to demands for political participation from every man who has not a farthing. The exclusion of enslaved people created the most glaring contradiction in American democratic theory, and the founders knew it. How could a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal simultaneously hold nearly 700,000 human beings in bondage and exclude them from all political participation? The answer reveals the sophisticated intellectual gymnastics that the founding generation employed to justify their exclusions. They developed what historians call racial republicanism, the idea that Republican government required a homogeneous citizenry and that racial diversity would inevitably lead to conflict and instability. Thomas Jefferson, despite his egalitarian rhetoric, believed that blacks and whites could never coexist as political equals and that emancipation would necessarily lead to racial war. The Three-Fifths Compromise embodied this contradiction in constitutional form. Enslaved people would be counted as three-fifths of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, but they would have no political rights whatsoever. This wasn't a compromise about humanity, it was a cold calculation about political power that gave Southern states additional representation in Congress based on their enslaved populations while denying those populations any voice in government. The compromise also reveals how the Constitution protected slavery rather than merely tolerating it. The Fugitive Slave Clause required Northern states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners. The prohibition on ending the international slave trade for 20 years protected the economic interests of slaveholders. The guarantee of federal assistance in suppressing domestic violence meant that the national government would help put down slave rebellions. Native Americans faced a different but equally exclusionary logic. The founders viewed Native American tribes as foreign nations, not potential citizens, which meant that tribal members were excluded from American democracy even when they lived within territorial boundaries claimed by the United States. This wasn't just legal technicality, it reflected a fundamental assumption that democratic citizenship required cultural assimilation to European American norms. The Treaty Clause of the Constitution formalized this approach by giving the federal government exclusive authority to negotiate with Native American tribes as if they were foreign nations. This created a legal fiction that allowed the United States to claim sovereignty over Native American lands, while simultaneously denying Native Americans any voice in the government that claimed to rule them. George Washington's approach to Native American relations revealed the calculating logic behind this exclusion. In private correspondence, Washington wrote about the need to civilize Native Americans by forcing them to abandon their traditional ways of life and adopt European American agriculture, religion, and social structures. Only then, Washington suggested, might they be eligible for some form of political participation, but as individuals who had abandoned their tribal identity, not as members of sovereign nations. The exclusion of men without property was perhaps the most theoretically consistent of all the founders' limitations on democracy, because it reflected core Enlightenment beliefs about the relationship between property ownership and political capacity. The founders believed that only those with property had the independence necessary for rational political judgment, while those without property would be dependent on others and therefore susceptible to corruption. John Adams articulated this logic most clearly when he argued that power always follows property, and that democratic government required voters who had stake in society that would motivate them to make decisions in the common interest rather than their narrow self-interest. Men without property, Adams argued, would inevitably vote to redistribute wealth from property owners to themselves, destroying the economic foundation of civilized society. The property requirements varied significantly among states, but they were substantial enough to exclude large numbers of white men from political participation. In Massachusetts, voters needed to own property worth at least 60 pounds or have an annual income of at least 3 pounds. Requirements that excluded approximately 25% of adult white men. In South Carolina, the requirements were even higher, excluding nearly half of white men from voting. These weren't arbitrary barriers. They reflected careful calculation about what level of wealth would ensure political reliability. The founders wanted voters who had enough property to be independent, but not so much wealth that they would become an aristocratic threat to Republican government. The ideal citizen was a middling property owner who had enough stake in society to be responsible but not enough power to be dangerous. Religious exclusions added another layer of limitation that reveals how the founders' conception of citizenship was tied to specific cultural and moral assumptions. Although the Constitution prohibited religious tests for federal office, many state constitutions required various forms of Christian belief for political participation. Several states excluded Catholics from office, while others required belief in Protestant Christianity or even specific Protestant denominations. These religious requirements weren't just anti-Catholic prejudice. They reflected deeper assumptions about the relationship between religious belief and political capacity. Protestant Christianity, in the founders' view, taught the individual responsibility and moral discipline necessary for Republican self-government, while Catholicism supposedly encouraged dependence on authority and superstition that made Catholics unsuitable for democratic participation. The exclusion of religious minorities also reflected fears about divided loyalty. Catholics were suspected of owing primary allegiance to the Pope rather than to American Republican institutions. Jews were viewed as a people apart whose religious distinctiveness would prevent their full assimilation into American political culture. These weren't just prejudices. They were systematic theories about the cultural requirements for democratic citizenship. The founders' vision of limited democracy wasn't just about excluding certain groups. It was about creating institutional structures that would prevent popular majorities from threatening elite interests even when they did gain political power. The Constitution includes multiple counter-majoritarian features designed to frustrate democratic control over government policy. The Electoral College ensures that presidents can be elected without winning the popular vote, giving disproportionate power to less populous states. The Senate gives equal representation to states regardless of population, meaning that voters in small states have much more influence per capita than voters in large states. The federal court system, with lifetime tenure for judges, insulates judicial power from democratic control. These features weren't accidents or compromises forced by practical necessity. They were conscious design choices intended to limit democratic power. Alexander Hamilton defended the Electoral College by arguing that it would prevent the people from making poor choices in presidential elections, while James Madison praised the Senate as a check on the fickleness and passion of the House of Representatives. The amendment process was intentionally made difficult, requiring supermajorities that would be nearly impossible to achieve on controversial issues. The founders wanted to prevent future Democratic majorities from easily changing the constitutional framework they had created to protect property rights and limit popular power. The Supreme Court's power of judicial review, while not explicitly stated in the Constitution, was anticipated by many founders as another check on democratic excess. The ability of unelected judges to strike down laws passed by Democratic majorities would provide a final safeguard against popular government that threatened elite interests. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the founders' approach to democracy was their assumption that the exclusions they created were not temporary expedients, but permanent features of good government. They didn't envision a gradual expansion of democratic rights. They believed they had identified the proper limits of political participation and designed institutions to maintain those limits indefinitely. James Madison's theory of the extended republic illustrates this perspective. Madison argued that a large, diverse nation would prevent the formation of popular majorities that could threaten property rights, because different regions and interests would be unable to unite around common policies. The goal wasn't to empower democratic majorities, but to fragment them into competing factions that would cancel each other out. The founders' correspondence reveals their horror at the idea of universal suffrage. When some states began eliminating property requirements in the early 19th century, many founders viewed these changes as dangerous departures from Republican principles that would inevitably lead to the destruction of property rights and constitutional government. Thomas Jefferson's later evolution on democratic participation was limited and conditional. While he became more supportive of expanded voting rights for white men, he never abandoned his belief that women, African Americans, and Native Americans were unsuited for political participation. His vision of democracy remained fundamentally exclusionary, even as it became somewhat more inclusive. The gradual expansion of American democracy that occurred in the 19th and 20th centuries wasn't the fulfillment of the founders' vision. It was a repudiation of it. Every major expansion of democratic rights, from the elimination of property requirements to women's suffrage to civil rights, required overcoming institutional barriers that the founders had deliberately created to prevent such changes. The Jacksonian era's elimination of property requirements for white men was fiercely resisted by traditional Federalists who viewed it as a dangerous abandonment of the founders' wisdom. The expansion of democracy to include propertyless white men was seen as an experiment that would inevitably lead to the destruction of property rights and constitutional government. The Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, represented a fundamental repudiation of the founders' assumptions about race and citizenship. The 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection and the 15th Amendment's prohibition on racial voting restrictions directly contradicted the founders' belief that racial diversity was incompatible with Republican government. But even these amendments were limited in their democratic vision. The 14th Amendment continued to exclude women from political participation, and the 15th Amendment included loopholes that allowed Southern states to effectively disenfranchise African Americans through literacy tests, poll taxes, and other devices that maintained white political control. The 19th Amendment's guarantee of women's suffrage represented perhaps the most fundamental challenge to the founders' assumptions about political capacity and democratic participation. The idea that women could participate equally in democratic government contradicted core Enlightenment beliefs about gender, rationality, and political judgment that had shaped the Constitution's original framework. The resistance to women's suffrage revealed how deeply embedded the founders' exclusionary assumptions had become in American political culture. Opponents argued that women's political participation would destroy family structures, corrupt politics with emotional decision-making, and violate natural law about gender roles that had guided human society throughout history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 completed the formal dismantling of the founders' exclusionary democracy by eliminating the legal barriers that had prevented African Americans from exercising political rights guaranteed by the Civil War amendments. But these changes required federal intervention to overcome state and local resistance that was rooted in the founders' assumptions about racial hierarchy and political capacity. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which eliminated racial quotas in immigration law, represented another repudiation of the founders' assumptions about citizenship and national identity. The founders had envisioned America as a white Protestant nation that would maintain its character through selective immigration and cultural assimilation. The 1965 Act opened American citizenship to people from all racial and religious backgrounds, fundamentally changing the demographic composition of American democracy. Even today, debates about voting rights, immigration, and political participation echo the founders' original concerns about the relationship between democracy and social order. Arguments about voter ID laws, felon disenfranchisement, and citizenship requirements often reflect continuing tensions between democratic inclusion and social control that were built into the American political system from its inception. The founders' vision of limited democracy also created institutional legacies that continue to shape American politics in ways that favor some groups over others. The Electoral College continues to give disproportionate power to less diverse, more rural states. The Senate's equal state representation means that the preferences of voters in predominantly white rural states can override the preferences of voters in more diverse urban states. The Supreme Court's power to strike down democratically enacted legislation continues to provide a check on popular government that can protect minority rights but can also protect elite interests from democratic challenge. The court's ability to interpret constitutional text in ways that limit democratic power reflects the founders' intention to constrain popular government through institutional design. Understanding the founders' exclusionary vision doesn't require condemning them as uniquely prejudiced or hypocritical. They were products of their time who shared the intellectual assumptions and social prejudices of 18th century elite culture. Their exclusions reflected systematic theories about political capacity, social order, and democratic government that were widely accepted among educated people of their era. But recognizing the historical context doesn't require accepting the founders' limitations as permanent or justified. The expansion of American democracy beyond the founders' vision represents genuine moral and political progress that has made American society more just and more truly democratic than the founders ever intended. The ongoing struggles over voting rights, political participation, and democratic inclusion show that the tension between the founders' exclusionary vision and democratic ideals continues to shape American politics. Each generation must decide whether to defend inherited limitations on democratic participation or to expand democracy beyond what previous generations thought possible or desirable. The founders' belief that democracy was too dangerous to be entrusted to everyone reflected genuine concerns about political stability and social order that remain relevant today. But their solution, excluding large portions of the population from political participation, created injustices and instabilities that have required centuries of struggle to address. Modern democracy faces new challenges about political participation and representation that the founders never imagined. Questions about campaign finance, lobbying, media influence, and economic inequality raise fresh concerns about whether formal democratic rights translate into meaningful political power for all citizens. The founders' exclusionary democracy was designed to protect property rights and maintain social order in a hierarchical society. Contemporary democratic theory must grapple with how to maintain political stability and effective governance while ensuring meaningful participation for all citizens in a diverse, complex society. The story of American democracy's gradual expansion beyond the founders' vision offers both inspiration and warning. It shows that political institutions can evolve to become more inclusive and just, but it also reveals how entrenched interests and institutional barriers can resist democratic change for generations. Understanding why American democracy was never meant for everyone helps explain both how far American society has traveled toward democratic inclusion and how far it still has to go. The founders' exclusions weren't accidents to be corrected, but features designed to preserve power for those they deemed worthy of political participation. The expansion of democracy beyond the founders' vision required sustained political struggle by excluded groups who demanded inclusion, despite institutional barriers designed to prevent it. Women, African Americans, working-class men, immigrants, and religious minorities all had to fight for political rights that the founders had deliberately denied them. These struggles weren't just about gaining voting rights. They were about challenging fundamental assumptions about political capacity, social hierarchy, and democratic government that had shaped American institutions from their inception. Each expansion of democracy required not just changing laws, but changing ideas about who deserved political participation and why. The incomplete nature of American democratic inclusion today reflects the continuing influence of institutional structures and cultural assumptions that trace back to the founders' exclusionary vision. The ongoing debates about voting rights, political representation, and democratic participation show that the tension between inclusive democratic ideals and exclusive political institutions remains unresolved. As we conclude this exploration of American democracy's exclusionary origins, I want to thank you for joining me at Professor Archive for this challenging examination of how political institutions can be designed to limit rather than expand democratic participation. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the achievements of those who struggled to expand democracy, but it does help us recognize how much work remains to be done. The founders' vision of limited democracy reflected both the intellectual assumptions of their era and their specific interests as members of a propertied elite who feared popular government. Their exclusions weren't accidental oversights, but deliberate design choices intended to preserve their power and privilege while creating the appearance of democratic legitimacy. The gradual expansion of American democracy beyond the founders' vision represents one of the great moral achievements in human history, but it also reveals how institutional barriers can resist democratic change for generations. Each expansion of political participation required overcoming obstacles that the founders had deliberately created to prevent such changes. The story of American democracy's evolution from exclusive republic to inclusive democracy remains unfinished. Contemporary debates about voting rights, political representation, and democratic participation show that the tension between democratic ideals and exclusive institutions continues to shape American politics today. What's your perspective on this complex legacy? How do you think we should balance respect for the founders' achievements with recognition of their limitations? What lessons can contemporary democracies learn from America's struggle to expand political participation beyond its exclusionary origins? I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts on these profound questions about democracy, inclusion, and political change. So please share them in the comments below. And don't forget to tell me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. These questions about who gets to participate in democracy resonate across all political systems and all eras. If this deep dive into the hidden exclusions behind American democracy's origins moved you, make sure you're subscribed to Professor Archive and have that notification bell activated. We explore the uncomfortable truths about political institutions, social change, and the ongoing struggle between democratic ideals and exclusive realities. Every week, we uncover stories that help us understand not just where we've been, but how historical legacies continue to shape contemporary political challenges. The next time you hear someone invoke the founders' vision of democracy, you'll understand that their vision was far more limited and exclusive than most people realize. American democracy wasn't founded on universal principles that just needed time to expand. It was designed as an exclusive system that required centuries of struggle to transform into something approaching democratic inclusion. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking to understand how the political institutions we inherit both enable and constrain the democratic possibilities available to each generation. This is Professor Archive, reminding you that the most important stories are often the ones that challenge our most cherished assumptions about how political institutions are supposed to work and who they're supposed to serve.